Okay, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be looking at natural hazards. I'm going to try to walk you through a bit of the content, and then we will see if we can just look at a few past paper questions. All right, so what we're going to try to do in this video is to discuss the main difference between natural hazard and natural disaster. We're going to look at areas in the Caribbean that are at high risk to various natural hazards. We are going to look at the impacts of natural disasters, and finally we are going to discuss the management of disaster and therefore the stages of the disaster management cycle. All right, so when we talk about natural hazards and natural disasters, the two terms are related but are a little different. Both natural hazards and natural disasters occur because of extreme events, which are basically processes that occur naturally. When we talk about natural hazards, we're talking about those extreme events that pose a threat to life and property. Now, if I threaten you, there is a possibility that I might not carry out the threat. Same thing with natural hazards. All right, so a natural hazard, it is very important when you're defining natural hazard to remember that it is a threat. It has the potential to affect lives and properties in a negative way. But always remember that it is just a potential. Now, if the natural hazard is actually realized, that is when it becomes a natural disaster. So the natural disaster is where an extreme event has a negative impact on lives and properties. All right. Now, in the Caribbean, there are a number of different extreme events that can affect Caribbean countries. The three main extreme events are earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and hurricanes. And recently, we have seen the unfortunate eruption of the volcano in St. Vincent. All right. Prior to it actually erupting, any signs that they would have seen would be an indication of a natural hazard. It would have been a threat. But when it actually erupted and it started causing a lot of problems so that people had to evacuate and move into shelters and farmlands destroyed and ash going into other Caribbean countries, at that point it became a disaster. All right. There are some places in the Caribbean that are at a greater risk of certain extreme events than others. So, for example, volcanic eruptions are more commonly expected in the Eastern Caribbean, because the Eastern Caribbean was actually formed as a result of volcanism. The American plate, the whose edge contains oceanic crust, sunk beneath the Caribbean plate, and then after sinking into the mantle, the rock melted, became magma, and then it started to rise to the surface. At the surface, a series of volcanoes were formed. And because these volcanoes rose above the level of the sea, they became islands. All right. So the Eastern Caribbean is mainly an island arc. All right. And it means, therefore, that the countries of the Eastern Caribbean are those that are most at risk for volcanic eruption. Now, when volcanic eruption occurs, some of the hazards that may happen includes landslides, ashfall, lava flow, pyroclastic flow, mud flow, and so forth. Then we have earthquakes. Earthquakes are more pervasive throughout the Caribbean than volcanic eruption, but it would mainly affect those places that are closer to the plate margins. When earthquakes occur, some of the hazards include tsunami, which is a giant wave that results from the earthquake focus being beneath the sea. Then we have liquefaction, where stable land becomes very unstable and begins to behave like liquid. Then, of course, landslides may occur, especially in hilly areas, and we could also have fires. Hurricanes are also hazards that affect a lot of Caribbean countries. Yet there are some Caribbean countries that are not as exposed to hurricanes as others. So because hurricanes need the Coriolis effect for their development, and the Coriolis effect will not occur at the equator, very close to the equator. Those places that are close to the equator, like Guyana and Suriname, they are less at risk of experiencing hurricanes than other Caribbean countries. When hurricanes occur, some of the hazards include wind damage, storm surge, flooding, and landslides. Now, even within a particular country, when, let's say, a hazard like hurricane occurs, the type of hazard that will occur will be dependent on the location. So, for example, we are expecting to see a greater occurrence of landslides in the hilly interior parts of Caribbean countries, while we would expect to experience storm surges along the coast. Floodplains are susceptible to flooding. All right. Now, we said that the thing that distinguishes the disaster from the hazard is that the disaster actually has negative impacts. Now, we could categorize these impacts into environmental impacts, that is, impacts on the atmosphere, impacts on the land, on the soil, on the water, on vegetation, and on wildlife. Then we could talk about social impacts. Social impacts have to do with people, with community, with health, with life, with relationships. All right. Then we have economic impacts. When we talk about economic impacts, we're thinking about money, things that has to do with the economy, things that will negatively impact the economy. So people might not be able to turn up for work, and therefore there would be less productivity. When we have less productivity, then it's going to affect trading. Sometimes in certain events, people may lose their jobs because there might not be enough money to pay persons. And that in turn will have a negative impact on the households. All of these different categories of impacts are, of course, interconnected. Now, because disasters are so dangerous and life-threatening, then it is very important for us to try to manage these disasters so that we can either try to prevent the disasters or at least try to reduce their impacts. Now, when we talk about disaster management, we can talk about a disaster management cycle, which consists of 4 main stages. These stages are mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Mitigation refers to the long-term strategies that are mainly aimed at preventing disasters. And these include establishment of building codes, because the quality of the buildings will impact the level of disaster. Creating land use zoning so that certain areas that are prone to disasters can be avoided. All right. What we have to remember is that when it comes on to hazards and disasters, it's not just the fact that the natural event or the natural process occurred, but it's also the fact that people are living in the areas and are carrying out activities in the areas where these events are occurring. All right. So maybe we cannot change the natural process itself, but maybe we can control some of the things that we do. All right. So the second stage of the disaster management cycle is preparedness. And preparedness includes the steps that we take towards becoming as ready as possible. And these include fire drills and earthquake drills and evacuation plans. And we will talk a little bit more about evacuation plans later on. The third stage of the disaster management cycle is response. And response is that stage that occurs during the disaster itself. So it is the immediate actions that we take during the disasters. and it includes rescue missions and having shelters and actually evacuating. And then the final stage of the disaster management cycle is recovery. And recovery is aimed at restoring normality. It includes fixing buildings and roads and even offering counseling to victims of the disaster. All right, so let me quickly run through them again. 4 stages: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Mitigation includes creating building codes and land use zoning, doing vulnerability analysis, and of course, public education. The whole aim of mitigation is to minimize the effects of disasters. Preparedness includes preparedness plans like or evacuation plans. It includes emergency exercises and training, as well as warning systems. Preparedness are the different strategies that we employ in an effort to be ready to respond. Then we have response, which includes search and rescue and emergency relief. These are efforts to minimize the hazards created by a disaster. And remember that the response usually occurs during the disaster itself. Recovery includes temporary housing, grants, and medical care. These are the things that we put in place to help to return the community to its normal conditions. Now, if we turn our attention on disaster preparedness, which is the second stage of the disaster management cycle, we're going to look at, we might be more familiar with our earthquake drills and our fire drills that are carried out at our workplace and or in our schools. But households can also create a family emergency plan. And if an emergency plan is going to be created, all family members, from the oldest to the youngest, as long as that person can reason, should be made to participate in the planning process. If everybody participates, then they will be a little bit more familiar with the plan and they will be more willing to commit to the plan. The plan should include meeting places and the family contacts. Everybody should know that if a certain hazard, disaster occurs, everybody should know that this is where we are planning to meet. Maybe it is at a relative's home, maybe it is in a public space, but everybody should know that beforehand, so that if when the disaster occur, maybe it's an earthquake, everybody will know. Maybe people are at different places, but at least they will know that this is where we're going to gather, and they should have the contact for each family member. All right, so everybody should have the other person's emergency contact, and it might include the person's cell phone, but it could also include their work numbers so that at least they can call the workplaces. Another thing that should be included in the family emergency plan is an evacuation plan. The evacuation plan should include the nearest shelter and the best escape routes to take. Now, when this is established, then the whole idea or objective of creating this evacuation plan is so that people can leave from one place to another in the safest and quickest way possible. Another thing that should be included in the family emergency plan is time to practice. So there should be some set times when some drills take place. Now, why practicing is important is that the more you do something is the more it becomes a part of you, and so it becomes second nature, so that when the actual disaster occurs, then it will be easy for the family members to know exactly what to do because it is being practiced. So it's important not that the family members do not just write a plan, but they also practice the plan so that in an emergency, it will be easy for them to execute the plan. All right. The family emergency plan should also include emergency supplies. All right, and these include water and food and medication. All of these things should be stored up. Flashlights also. Anything that is needed should be stored up, or persons should know exactly where these things are kept so that they can have easy access to these things. All right. Another thing is to create a plan of how you will receive warnings and emergency alerts. All right. In many disasters, there is no electricity. So it's very important that the family has battery powered radios so that you can get quick and easy updates about what is going on in the country. All right. And then it is also important that within this family emergency plan, insurance policies are established, including life insurance and insurance for property. This will help to lessen the burden on the family, the financial burden on the family, and it will help the family to recover faster. All right. Now, the whole aim of the family emergency plan is to reduce stress on the family members and to ensure that the family members remain as safe as possible. All right. So I hope you have a better idea of what natural hazard is all about and the importance of disaster management, as well as the impacts of disasters on people and their property. Now we want to look at some questions, some CSEC past paper questions that are related to this topic. Now, what I want you to remember is that the exam, there are certain areas that are going to be tested in the exam. These include practical skills, knowledge and comprehension, as well as the use of knowledge. All right. So sometimes when you are at the very beginning of most questions, you are tested on practical skills. And in the case of this question, there is a table. You're being asked to examine the table and to answer some questions based on the table. Now, it's very easy for students to make some simple mistakes. So even though this part is, it's easy for you to gain full marks for this part of the exam, you still have to be very careful. All right. So number 1 says, which area had the fewest deaths from disasters? The answer is Australasia, but what you have to be careful to avoid is the mistake of writing the number of deaths instead of the place where the fewest deaths occurred. All right. Second question says, what was the combined total loss of lives for Africa and Asia during the period? Now, this calls for a bit of calculation. Now, sometimes you use your calculator, and then in the process of transferring the number from the calculator to your paper, you miss a number. So for something like this, even when you are writing down the numbers, do a double check. The last question says, what is the difference in the relationship between number of disasters and number of lives lost in Europe and Africa? So for this, it is calling for a little bit of thought, unlike the other questions where you could actually pick the answer from the table. You have to think, you have to interact with the table a bit in order to come up with your answer. All right. So the answer, Europe had more disasters, but less loss of life per event. Africa had less disasters, but more loss of lives per event. All right. Now, for knowledge and comprehension, we're going to look at 2 questions. One is a question that is asking you to define, and the other is asking you to describe. All right. When you are defining, remember, you're simply giving the meaning of the term. This is why you need to study your definitions. And when you're describing, you are stating the characteristic of a feature, and you are expected to elaborate. So it's not just to just state, you are expected to elaborate. All right. So the first one, define the term natural hazard. A natural hazard is an extreme event that threatens life and property. All right. So remember the term threatens, or maybe you want to put in the word potential, just to show that there is a possibility that the event may or may not affect life and property. You have to convey that idea through your definition. All right, second question, describe 3 impacts of any of the following. earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes. Now, you are given the chance to choose to select one of these. Select the one that you know most about. And also, when you select the one that you're talking about, you need to indicate it by writing it down. So you write down impacts of earthquake. Earthquakes may result in loss of lives due to buildings being damaged. All right. So loss of life can occur as a result of any hazard at all, any disaster, any event. That's what I should say. It could occur as a result of the earthquake, the volcano, the hurricane. But what you need to do is to make a link between the impact and the event itself. So we know that one of the things that may happen commonly in an earthquake is that as the land is being shaken, the buildings are shaken, and the buildings may be damaged and may topple over. All right. And so people may die during the process. You want to make that link. All right. Now, the second point, in hilly areas, earthquakes may trigger landslides, which may destroy farmlands along or at the foot of the slope. All right. So again, the impact that we are looking at in this case, it's an economic impact because farmlands are now being destroyed, and we are linking it to something that we know happens in an earthquake, which is landslides. And the next thing we could say, earthquakes which have their focus beneath the seafloor may cause a tsunami, which may result in the destruction of coral reefs and beaches. Now, I just wanted to put in that because I was just trying to show you that you could talk about environmental impacts, you could talk about social impacts, you could talk about economic impacts. But based on the question, you could talk, the three impacts could have been social, the three of them could have been economic. It is your choice. All right. I just chose those three so that you could know, have an idea of the way that you could talk about each of the different impacts. The important thing I want you to remember is that if you're going to be answering a question like this, ensure that you show that the impact you're talking about, you want to link it to the extreme event that you are describing. All right, so let's look at this question, which is use of knowledge. It says, outline 3 ways by which natural hazards can affect economic development of the Caribbean. All right, so you need to establish in your mind, and you could do it on the paper too, like I have done, what economic development is. Economic development is a process by which a country improves the economy and social well-being of its people. And the question says, outline 3 ways by which hazards can affect economic development. So what we're actually trying to do is we want to show how the natural hazards can slow down the growth of the economy and the social well-being of people. All right. If natural hazards become disasters, production may be slowed down. All right, so that's the economy being affected. For example, during and after a hurricane, roads may become impassable and workers may not be able to get to work. Disasters such as hurricanes and volcanic eruptions can destroy crops and livestock. All right, so that's agriculture being negatively impacted by the disaster. Natural disasters may destroy roads and buildings. The money to repair damages will reduce the national budget. Many lives may be lost during a disaster. Now, that's a social impact. But as I said, the social impact, the environmental impact, and the economic impacts, they are interconnected. So even though that's a social impact, it can have it can be it can extend itself into an economic impact. Not only will it cost to bury these persons, the labor force will be affected, which will again slow down production. So some key players in the workplace could lose their lives or become seriously injured during a disaster, and this in turn may negatively impact the economy. All right. All right, so the last question we're going to look at says, explain 3 ways that an individual should prepare for the effects of the hazard you have described in C. All right, so this is a follow-up question. We did not include the first part of this question, but we're just going to look at this. All right, measures to reduce the impact of hurricanes. Individuals can wrap important documents in plastic. That is a measure, but you want to link that. You want to give it a reason. You want to say why it is that you are actually carrying out this particular measure. In order to reduce the risk of damages due to flooding. You don't want your important documents to be damaged or destroyed, because sometimes all of the time and the money that it's going to cost you to get back those documents, I mean, if you can avoid it, definitely you want to do that. So that is one measure. Individuals may also batten down roofs in an effort, sorry, that should be in an effort to reduce the impact of wind damages. All right, same thing, we're stating the strategy and we're giving the reason for the strategy. And notice we're linking it to the natural event. So we're talking about wind damages. Another measure which may be taken by individuals is to bring animals inside from the outdoors, which may reduce the risk of the animals being killed or injured by floodwaters or strong winds. All right, and as I mentioned, animals, if we look back at the emergency plan, the family emergency plan, that's another thing that could be included in the family emergency plan. A place, establishing a place for your pets. If you, since you will not be able to bring these animals into shelters if you have to go there, you need to have some designated areas where you're going to keep these pets. All right, so I hope this was useful to you, and I wish you all the best in your exams. Remember to study and to pray, and you will really do well. Okay, all right, thank you. If this was useful to you, please share, subscribe, like,
and leave a good comment. All right, thank you.